Generally speaking, France makes better wine than Australia. Sad for me to admit, I know, but it's the truth. The main reason for this is fairly pragmatic. We have some very nice vineyards, but bottom to middle shelf Australian wine has to use a lot of sulfates for preservative stabilisation in our hot, dry climate. So, hypothetically, you've come over for a delicious Sunday roast at my house and I offer you two choices of wine with dinner. A cheap $10 bottle of Sauvignon Blanc from the Bordeaux region of France, or a $700 bottle of 1985 Penfolds Grange Hermitage from the Barossa Valley in South Australia, arguably one of the best Australian wines ever bottled. Which would you prefer with your meals, sir? Yes, generally speaking, the French do make better wine, but choosing to only focus on the country of origin tells us almost nothing about the contents of an individual bottle. If you were a wine connoisseur who wanted to start a new cellar of fine wines, you would be much better served by carefully selecting a variety of high-end wines from all over the world, rather than simply buying whatever cheap, disgusting piss water is on sale that day at your local supermarket, solely on the mistaken generalization that it's French wine, therefore it must be the best wine. I apologise to those who don't need this spelt out to them like children, but it seems that a not insubstantial percentage of alt-right folks who commented on my last video are fundamentally incapable of wrapping their heads around the rather simple distinction between a group average and any particular individual distributed within that group. Almost every single comment left by an acolyte of the alt-right complained that what I was saying in my video was perfectly in line with the position of the alt-right, and they couldn't understand the point I was getting at. If IQ is the most important factor for social success, and average IQ is correlated with race, why not just use race as a proxy standard for immigration? Well, let's compare and contrast the alt-right position with what I'm suggesting. They are effectively operating on the assumption that we only want French wine because based on the average, French wine is better than wines from elsewhere. The only thing that matters is the group average. So fuck these savages, right? But all of these people are A-OK because they's white folks. Praise pasty white Jesus and just let them all in. If we let in 1,000 of them, that means we're letting in 500 people above the average IQ of 100 and 500 people below the average. Then we have what I'm suggesting, the connoisseur's approach of carefully selecting the top shelf wine from multiple regions on the basis of individual quality. Let's make the cutoff one standard deviation above the European mean. These people are okay, let in 1,000 of them. No shit, you are going to end up with more East Asians and white Europeans than sub-Saharan Africans or Hispanics, but whoever you let in, all of them will be above the average IQ regardless of their skin colour. Again, I apologise to those who already get it and really don't need population distributions explained to them, but for those who don't get it, a group average is not directly indicative of any particular individual that we examine within that group, such as we might on an individual's visa application. A number of people accused me of ignoring the correlation between race and average IQ. However, whilst these alt-right guys are accusing me of ignoring the correlation between race and the group average, they themselves are only able to maintain their own position by essentially wishing away the distribution curves of these groups. No, the alt-right's method is a fucking shit way of doing things, and regardless of how many people seem to completely miss the point, the premise of my video was absolutely not in line with the alt-right's so-called race realism. I am mostly of Irish descent. Going by the rather shitty, backwards, reductive reasoning employed by these guys, I should have an IQ of 92 because that's the national average of Ireland. FYI, that isn't the case. I am some ways above that. Same goes for Clive and his Nigerian ancestry. Despite the fact that there is a correlation between average IQ and genetic populations, individuals will fall along a distribution curve within that population. As long as we are already assessing individuals on visa applications and the like, we may as well be doing it on the basis of careful IQ selection rather than the sloppy proxy method of racism. In other words, let's make sure we're getting the top shelf wine. We want this end of the bell curve, regardless of race. I don't know about you, but personally, I'd much rather be living next door to Thomas Sowell than the white swamp folks from Deliverance because homogeneity good, diversity bad. It was amazing to me that so many of these alt-right commenters just couldn't wrap their heads around this simple distinction between my position and theirs. They just couldn't comprehend the fact that a group average doesn't tell us where a particular individual falls along the distribution curve within that group. I suppose the simplest explanation is that my position wasn't particularly well represented or articulated, but as more and more of these same comments were left fundamentally failing to grasp this distinction, I actually started thinking maybe the problem is that these alt-right guys don't actually understand the implications or the logic of their own position. It really made me question, are the alt-right actually honest with themselves? Are they actually honest with others about their own positions? At its most fundamentally defining characteristic, exactly what is the alt-right? This ultimately brings us to the alternative hypothesis. I'm just going to state this clearly from the outset. We are never going to have the debate you want. And the reason for this is that you seem fundamentally disinterested with any kind of honest exchange. You misrepresented Stardusk.
But then Stardust comes in and says, no, you're just a dumbass, that's all you are, an individual, an isolated, sad little man. Of course, Stardust doesn't quite say it like that, but he might as well.
You misrepresented CS.
And CS MGTOW's source for what constitutes a weak, moderate, and strong correlation is a dummy's guide to statistics.
And as for me, well,
mainly to Colttran's video IQ and National Success. In it, he claims that the alt-right doesn't think IQ matters for national success.
A mere 10 seconds into your response and you are already arguing against shit that I never said in my video. Another 10 seconds and we get to my favourite part.
And he comes to this conclusion on the basis of a YouTube comment.
Ha! If you're really going to start your response by falsely claiming that my entire opinion of the alt-right was informed by a single YouTube comment, then you are either a lot more dishonest or a lot more fucking stupid than I originally suspected. I mean, Jesus Christ, guy, literally the very first thing out of my mouth in that video was, "This is a video that I was planning to make anyway, but it's been further spurred on by a comment left on the recent MGTOW talk video between Stardusk and Tildeer. Yeah, I was planning to make the video anyway. My opinions of the alt-right were not informed by this one YouTube comment from some random douchebag which I only addressed because he directly accused CS and myself of spreading propaganda. And of course, by propaganda, he meant that we discussed facts that didn't fit his a priori ideological conclusions. My opinion was actually informed by the publicly stated positions of many different high-profile members of the alt-right, such as Millennial Woes here, also lamenting the big black cocks laying their hands on his precious white women.
You're going to make me feel proud, in fact, that I have this sense of duty, this sense of common feeling kinship with white women. You think I shouldn't have a visceral reaction to a dark-skinned savage assaulting a white woman, a woman of my group?
Or Pale Hominid here saying that accepting high IQ East Asians would be the least worst of a bad situation.
I mean, let's say there was some horrific crisis in the Korean Peninsula, and I know white nationalists would disagree with me on this, but I think we would have virtually none of the problems if there was, an exodus of 1 million Koreans coming in Germany. In fact, they probably would boost the economy, and Europe would be better for it.
Everyone that I know of in the alt-right would agree that they would certainly be less objectionable. I think I've seen a lot of people say and agree that, if East Asians were the primary source of immigration, they would still not want that to be the case. They would still be very disturbed by that. They would still feel as though they were being racially replaced. But it would absolutely be a much different character.
Well, okay, but I guess that is the core difference, and I wouldn't care.
Is Millennial Woes not concerned with race mixing? Is pale hominid not prioritising racial homogeneity over high IQ? I guess I'll leave it up to the discretion of the audience to decide whether my assessment of these alt-right figureheads is completely misguided. I mean, personally, I rather dislike these sorts of positions.
Anyway, I replied, they need another Hitler. I said that. I said, they need another Hitler.
But I will give Millennial Woes this. I respect the guy. He has integrity. I disagree with virtually everything the man says. In fact, I find many of his positions completely detestable. But at least he's upfront and honest about his position, and more broadly, the position of the alt-right in general. I would say that overall, I found the response from the alt-right commenters fairly disappointing. But there is a silver lining. The various exchanges that I've had following my last video have been enlightening in one particular way. I have actually developed a better appreciation and understanding of what the alt-right actually is. See, I get why guys like Alternative Hypothesis will flagrantly misrepresent people they disagree with, like myself, Stardusk, and CS. You know, subscribers always like to see a good takedown, even if it's a takedown of a completely fictional straw man. But it's interesting that apart from misrepresentation of others, these guys all work so hard to obfuscate and misrepresent the alt-right itself when it's under scrutiny. They don't want you to know what their real underlying motives are, and I think most of this can be traced back to their pet term, race realism. Many years ago, I was primarily involved in the online atheist community. And during that time, one of the interesting things that many in the community observed was the method by which Christian apologetics operated. It's really funny, you see, not a single one of these guys actually believes in God for any of the reasons that they publicly debate. Matt Slick doesn't actually believe in God because of the calm cosmological argument. Kent Hovind doesn't believe in God because of bizarre ideas about ice shields. And Ray Comfort doesn't believe in God because of the fucking shape of bananas. Ultimately, each and every single one of these Christian apologists believes in God for completely crazy, irrational reasons. And then from that default starting position, they all madly scramble backwards, trying to find any pseudo-logical argument in their reach to prop up their pre-existing religious conclusions. And the alt-right is exactly the fucking same. They are, for all intents and purposes, the religious apologetics movement for ideological racism. I mean, don't get me wrong, I am not arguing, nor have I ever argued, that there aren't correlations between certain genetic groups and certain phenotypic averages, whether we're talking about clearly visible traits like skin colour, more action-oriented traits like athletic ability, or completely abstract traits like problem-solving intelligence. There most certainly are variances between the averages of different genetic populations. What I am arguing, however, is that much like the Christian apologists, I doubt any of these alt-right guys ultimately believe in white nationalism because of the science. The science is really an afterthought to try and prop up their already existing racism to appear more legitimate and palatable in mainstream debate. In other words, the alt-right's so-called race realist conclusions actually come first, and then the facts are carefully selected, manipulated, or simply crafted from whole cloth to fit their default ideological assumptions about race afterwards. For example, the alt-right will certainly pay lip service to the importance of factors like IQ. Hell, they'll even go so far as to argue that what I've said actually supports their position. But that lip service lasts only as long as these factors continue to make pure-blooded white folks look like they occupy the top tier. The second you point out that the smartest genetic population are the Ashkenazi, who make up only 2% of the US population, but account for 27% of American Nobel Prize winners and 25% of field medalists, oh, well, that's just Jewery. It's a Jewspiracy. Welcome to the Jew world order. And it only gets more ridiculous once they try and replace their tinfoil hat Jewspiracy rhetoric with more reasonable sounding quasi-scientific factoids. That's when we start hearing about how, Oh, the Jews only have higher verbal intelligence. Yeah, apparently the Jews aren't smarter, they're just sneakier. Those sneaky Jews. I bet it must be so easy for them to con their way into a fucking Fields Medal. Are you serious? The Judenhass of the alt-right is damn near pathological. It really is an amazing thing to see when all of the pretense is momentarily dropped. You see, that's when you can catch a brief glimpse of what these people are actually about. And believe me, it has fucking nothing to do with so-called race realism. They've dressed it up with more palatable, sciencey sounding rhetoric, but under that thin veneer of intellect and calm political discourse, even the highest profile public figureheads of the alt-right are nothing but the same old fascists stuck in a perpetual time warp fretting over crazy Adolf's Jewish question.
Well, that's where, what Ramsey Paul does, that's really the key to that right there. I think it's, as you said earlier, Lana, as well, about going in the back door. And obviously that's not done just because you're sly and want to push something on people that you don't believe in.
You just know that you have to reach the masses, but you can't come out with the JQ first thing when you meet some girl at the hair salon. Hey, do you know that the Jews are genociding the white race? That's going to go over real well. You got to be slicker about these things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the same goes for the genetic populations from East Asia, like the Han Chinese. Yes, the alt-right knows all about IQ and race. Oh yes, we know everything. We basically invented the whole thing. It's so passé that everyone is only just now starting to talk about it. But then you go one step further and start to talk about the inconvenient fact that according to this very same IQ data, East Asians average 5 points higher than Western Europeans. And then suddenly you start hearing all of these bullshit backtracking excuses like, well, East Asians have a higher IQ, but they have a narrower distribution curve. Or, yeah, they have a higher IQ, but they're less creative. Thousands of years of stories, theatre, music, art, poetry, philosophy, science, engineering, gunpowder, swords made from steel folded up to 16 times. Even making tea is an art unto itself. East Asian cultures tend to place a higher premium on self-discipline, but they certainly don't seem to suffer from any biological lack of creativity. In fact, in a recent Stardusk video, he pointed out that according to Bloomberg's Innovation Index, the top country in terms of innovation is currently South Korea. It reminds me of a picture I saw in Creation magazine many years ago while staying at my crazy religious auntie's house. It was a picture trying to explain away the evolved genetic diversity of animals from across the globe, particularly in places of relative ecological isolation like Australia and Madagascar. I think from memory the image was captioned, "Why are there koalas in Australia but not elsewhere?" It depicted a map of the world with cartoon animals running away from Noah's Ark in the direction of all the different continents. Apparently, they ran across the oceans all frozen solid by an ice age, which then melted, trapping them in their new geographic homes. Now, the whole thing is fairly fucking hokey to begin with. But the most hilarious thing about that argument is that the only reason we even know that an ice age occurred at all is because of the very same geological data that these young Earth creationists would otherwise reject on the basis that it contradicts their biblical interpretation of a 10,000-year-old Earth. It is selection bias at its worst, and the methods of the alt-right seem very similar to the creationists when it comes to issues like race and IQ. They will pay the science lip service when it suits them, but they are less concerned with the overall data set and a lot more interested in whatever small snippets of that data can be shoehorned in to best fit their ideology at any given time. And that brings us back to the initial question. Why couldn't any of these alt-right commenters grasp the distinction between a group average and any particular individual distributed somewhere within that group? The answer is rather simple. It's not because they couldn't grasp it, it's because they refused to grasp it. In this particular context, accepting the mere existence of a normal distribution within these groups would not fit their already rigidly established ideology of racism and white supremacy. You see, if you insist that the issue can only be discussed in terms of group averages, then you can easily argue that all white Europeans are better than all black Africans. But the second we start talking about the distribution of individuals within that group, well, then one has to accept the existence of Nigerians like CS, who are probably smarter than anybody on the alt-right. In fact, even going beyond individuals like CS and just looking at the overall distribution curve, even with a national IQ average, which falls 2 entire deviations below the European average, it would still mean that over 2% of Nigerians are above the Western European average of 100. In a country of 182 million, that's a segment of almost 4 million people. That's enough people to replace the population of a small European country like Scotland and not see a single drop in the country's average IQ. Now, I know how guys like Alternative Hypothesis love to build their straw men from hypothetical statements like this. I can imagine it now. Colttaine says that all Scottish people should be replaced with Africans. No, I am not even remotely suggesting that entire populations should be displaced. That would be fucking ridiculous. My point is simply that it would be equally ridiculous to assume on the basis of a national average that nobody within this pool of potential would be beneficial to your society if they wish to emigrate. Certainly more beneficial than opting to take in Haggis McHaggis, the low IQ sheep farmer from the Highlands, simply because he has the preferred skin complexion. What the alt-right seems to consistently miscomprehend is that we can learn an awful lot about how this system called human civilization generally functions by looking at averages. We can clearly see, based on the averages, that the single most important factor to national success by a long shot is IQ. Those averages show us in unequivocal terms that what we want, what we need, is smart people. But, and this is the important part, those averages do not tell us whether any particular individual is smart. The reality at the individual level is that based on raw numbers, there are probably more smart Nigerians in this world than there are smart Scotsmen. But of course, that reality just cannot be addressed in the face of these people's facile ideology. They'll try desperately to keep the conversation strictly focused on national averages in a vain attempt to pretend that no smart Nigerians exist anywhere. And when that tactic finally reaches breaking point and fails, when they're finally forced to address population distributions, they will just come up with entirely new bullshit excuses like regression to the mean. In typical fashion for these people, the best lie is often a half-truth. Whilst regression to the mean is a real phenomenon in quantitative genetics, it bears very little resemblance to the bastardized misinterpretation peddled by the alt-right, where successive generations of offspring will magically regress back to a static, idealized racial archetype, somehow frozen in genetic time. Honestly, this interpretation of genetics is so thoroughly misguided that if the alt-right were actually correct, evolution itself would cease to function, as it would be impossible for future generations to change and adapt to selection pressures, ultimately forming new genetic populations with new group averages. The way regression to the mean actually functions in genetics is that traits are never 100% heritable. From generation to generation, the expression of these phenotypic traits are affected to a degree by random variants, broadly labelled environmental factors. IQ is about 60 to 75% genetically heritable. If you isolate a selection of higher than average IQ individuals, many of them will be some degree smarter than their parents due to this environmental variance happening beyond the direct influence of their heritable genes. Now, this is the most important part which is constantly and, dare I say, deliberately omitted by proponents of the alt-right who like to rely on this argument. When you look at an isolated population like this, the regression only occurs once. After only one generation of offspring, any outliers in the original parental population caused by this random environmental variance have basically been re-randomized and therefore reset, causing a slight regression in the offspring back towards the previous parental average, but also meaning that this new generation you're left with is effectively a whole new genetic population with an entirely new population mean, based solely on heritability rather than any previously existing environmental outliers. In other words, if this population were to remain isolated, any future generations of offspring will remain grouped around this new mean and not regress any further backwards. Our ability to selectively breed livestock is literally dependent on genetics functioning this way. As Professor of Anthropology Greg Cochran succinctly writes on the subject of regression, eugenics is not only possible, it is trivial. That's all it takes, one generation to reset the random variance of any potential outliers that existed in the previous generation, and after that slight regression, we are left with a new subpopulation with a new average based almost entirely on that trait's heritable genes. It is an incredibly important factor to be omitted, and it changes the entire meaning of regression to the mean from this barely recognizable Frankenstein version which the alt-right have tried to breathe life into. You want to talk about race realism? Well, that, my friends, is the reality of race. Broad genetic populations are not based on static, monolithic 19th century archetypes which everything magically regresses back to. They are constantly changing, they are widely distributed, and they have various distinct subpopulations due to a variety of factors, such as economic class stratification or even simple geographic differences, which in itself represents another problem with trying to apply concepts like the breeder's equation to human populations at the national level, even if it's not the completely bastardized version the alt-right are pushing. The breeder's equation and regression are specifically about selecting outliers from a known population of livestock and isolating them for breeding in the next generation. Nations are not necessarily known populations. The population at the top end of the national curve is not necessarily the same population as the middle or the low end of the curve. We are not talking about a single homogeneous stock like cows in a pen here. Human populations practice self-segregation. It's basically self-imposed eugenics. As we look at genetic populations with higher and higher resolution, we don't see uniformity. We see more and more splintering. For example, we know that the blanket term Asian isn't very useful, as it can refer to anything from Indonesia to Korea to the subcontinent of India. But even talking specifically about the fact that the Chinese have an average IQ of 105 is far from telling the whole story. We can actually see that even in China, the IQ varies by province, with the highest IQs concentrated around the major cities on the coast and the lower IQs concentrated inland. Even though we refer to them as a single genetic population, just by bent of geography, it's unlikely that a businessman living in Shanghai will find himself having a child with a Tibetan villager. Even geographically confined to the streets of Shanghai, that 130 IQ businessman probably doesn't associate with low IQ street thugs. His wife probably comes from a family of similar social strata. His children probably go to an exclusive school. Within that exclusive school, his children would be sorted into classes based on their aptitude, which would further inform their social group and the circle of friends they make growing up. The further down the rabbit hole of genetics you go, the more fractured a population becomes. You can't just look at 1 billion Chinese people as a ubiquitous genetic blob and understand what's going on within subpopulations, much less at the individual level. Same goes for Nigeria. CS is a really smart guy, but that obviously isn't just because of some completely random environmental aberration from the broad genetic population that we call West African. As we've already discussed, regression to the mean due to environmental variance only happens once in an isolated group. Assuming that his parents were also smart, and perhaps even his parents' parents, then very little of his high intelligence would be accounted for by extreme outlying environmental variance. If his IQ is close to the mean IQ of his family, that being his immediate genetic subpopulation, then any children he may have are not going to regress back to the Nigerian national average of 71. A race, or rather a broad genetic population, is not homogeneous. There are different subpopulations that the alt-right are mistakenly, or perhaps intentionally, conflating to be one homogeneous group. The truth is that even accounting for random environmental variance, the heritable apple still doesn't fall that far from the genetic tree, even at this end of the national population distribution. It would be a mistake to talk about an elite athlete as a freak genetic outlier to the national population average, rather than taking into account their family, which is basically their immediate subpopulation. Out of a total population of 300 million, there are only 446 players in the American NBA. However, it is not some completely random 1 in a million fluke that Kobe Bryant, one of the greatest basketballers to ever live, was himself the son of pro basketball player Joe Bryant. Likewise, a smart Nigerian will typically come from a family of smart Nigerians. In other words, like Kobe Bryant, the overwhelming majority of the people on this end of the IQ distribution are not just extreme aberrations who've somehow randomly found themselves 2 whole deviations above their mud hut dwelling parents, which according to the alt-right they will invariably regress back to. The very notion that 2 genius-level black people will have a child with an even lower IQ than 2 dumb white parents is patently fucking absurd. Despite the mountain of misinformed crap that guys like Crusader Cat have been shoveling in my comment section lately, that is absolutely not how quantitative genetics and regression to the mean works. And if you rely on this little alt-right factoid as an argument, well, I am very sorry to break this to you, but no sir, your racism is not actually supported by the science. You may well be an engineer, but apparently you know sweet fuck all about genetics. But of course, that will never be the end of the matter. There is no end in sight for these people because they are not concerned with the truth. They will never settle for any conclusion that doesn't perfectly match the pre-selected outcomes of their white supremacist ideology. You call them on prioritizing racial homogeneity over IQ, and they carry on about broad population averages. You call them on ignoring population distributions, and then they carry on about regression to the mean. You call them on their complete misunderstanding of genetics. Well, I can only guess at what new excuses will follow in the comments section. There was even a part in that alternative hypothesis response to Stardusk where he literally tries to argue that even if a black person has high IQ, they still can't possibly have a high IQ because alt-right reasons.
And so if you take the whole score, blacks in this probably scored like 85 overall compared to the white 100 or something. What's important from a psychometric standpoint is that on item 12, whites got the answer correct 72% of the time, blacks got it 33% of the time. And on item 24, whites got the correct answer 64% of the time, and blacks got it right 21% of the time. Right, racial gap is bigger on the more difficult question.
No shit, guy. You have to be smarter to answer the harder questions on the test. Due to the different population means, there are proportionally less black people than white people at this end of the graph, meaning those numbers being rattled off are exactly what we'd expect to see when you intentionally focus on this narrow section of overlap between the two population distributions. It's hardly a profound observation, but of course, being the studious alt-right researcher that he is, he decides to dig deeper into what I can only assume was his colon. From this one narrow segment of the graph, he then directly conflates the population percentage on the y-axis with the actual measured IQ value on the x-axis to claim that the gap between whites and blacks should therefore be 70 IQ points instead of 15.
Which is why saying, the black-white IQ gap is 15 points, is okay, is true, but if you just gave the hardest questions, you could say the racial gap is 70 IQ points.
Bravo! I mean, that's just fabulous. But why stop there? I mean, you're already standing out on a ledge of pure bullshit. You may as well just take that final leap of pseudo-logic and claim that because of the proportional difference in population here, an individual black man from that population must therefore still be dumber than an individual white man, even if these two individuals have, quote-unquote, the same IQ.
And so you'll probably have an easier time explaining a complex concept to a white person than to a black person, even if they have, quote-unquote, the same IQ.
I mean, fuck me. It actually hurts my brain. The sheer nonsense that comes out of these people's mouths is some of the most underhanded, dishonest, manipulative, lying, misinformed horse shit I have ever heard in my life. Easily on par with the worst of the worst young earth creationists. It's just a constant stream of ill-conceived excuses strung together one after another. What the alt-right are doing doesn't even remotely resemble science. It's the exact same charlatanry and chicanery employed by the Christian apologetics movement. It's a gish gallop. It's a fucking crapshoot. They throw out as much racist junk science as they possibly can to support their white supremacist ideology, and then they just make their arguments based on whatever happens to stick. When you actually do the research and get most of that nonsense cleared up, they just throw out more rubbish. It all comes down to this. Ultimately, their position has nothing to do with so-called race realism, and everything to do with the simple fact that these guys just don't like other races. They're not interested in the truth. They're only interested in proving that white people are better than blacks, or Asians, or Hispanics, or whoever. Even other white people, if you happen to be the wrong kind of white. The facts and the methodology always remain secondary to their ideological status quo. First and foremost, the alt-right appears to be a religious apologetics movement for ideological racism. Whatever follows on from that default starting position seems to be an afterthought for the sole purpose of trying to maintain their pre-established ideological race conclusions. Sometimes what follows their a priori racist beliefs is actually accurate data, like the fact that broad genetic populations display different average frequencies of traits like IQ. Other times it's half-truths and misrepresentations of real scientific concepts like regression to the mean to try and claim that any benefits displayed by a non-white must only be temporary. Given the right circumstances, fundamental statistical aspects like population distributions are willfully and entirely ignored to try and claim that any individual from another group must be bad based on that group's average. Every now and then, they will just invent factoids out of whole cloth, like a narrower distribution curve to try and explain away things like the higher East Asian IQ, and on rare occasions, they will drop the act entirely and just honestly tell you how much they fucking hate the Jews. I think any pretense that the alt-right's race realism is an evidence-based conclusion can reasonably be dropped at this point. There are some guys like Alternative Hypothesis who do a truly fantastic job of dressing it up to look otherwise, but honestly, it is so transparent to me at this point that it actually reminds me of this scene out of the TV show Community.
Guess it goes to prove what I already knew. Non-whites ruin everything.
Joshua was racist. That came out of nowhere. Did it?
It's going to be a maze.
Yeah, I ain't fucking buying it anymore. The term is a misnomer. It's not actually race realism. At its core, it's really just the same old racism it has always been, with a handful of carefully selected factoids tacked on to make it sound more legitimate. I know I've already said this, but I really have to give credit to Millennial Woes for just coming straight out and saying shit like this.
And honestly, this is why if we are to win these debates, I think we have to be completely open about our racism from the start, or our race realism from the start.
I don't agree with him, but by God, it is so refreshing to hear one of these guys openly state what they're actually about. The alt-right, and specifically guys like Alternative Hypothesis, will forge on, continuing to craft their various racist apologetics. You can be absolutely sure that nothing I've pointed out here will have any impact on that. At the end of the day, ideologues don't have a habit of changing their positions. But for now, I am fucking done with the alt-right and their antics. I think as we part ways, I'll leave you all with Bernard Black, who articulates my current feelings towards the alt-right far more eloquently than I ever could myself.
Right. Look, this is you, okay?
Sorry, brah, but the alt-right has known all about Lynn's research into the correlation between IQ and national outcomes for quite a while. I'm dishonest, according to the guy who's based his idea of what the alt-right believes based on a YouTube comment, despite using data from Richard Lynn, who is one of the formative thinkers of the alt-right. Also, Colttaine still hasn't admitted that it was the progenitors of the alt-right who first talked about and seriously studied the relationship between IQ and national outcome. Herrnstein. Ain't that one of them Jew names? LOLs!